Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Today, we have Jean Campbell with us. Jean Campbell has been bringing together groups of people to heal for more than 30 years. As CEO of Action Institute of California, she blends her extensive experience in psychodrama, sociometry, somatic experiencing, and psychodramatic bodywork to provide psychodrama training workshops for professionals, staff training, team building, and leadership workshops. Jean is somebody I have known for several decades, and we rarely get to see each other and rarely get to talk about our work with one another. I did go to one of your workshops many, many years ago, but this is a chance to chat. And I love this because I'm really looking forward to catching up with you and understanding more about what you're up to. And our topic, it's all about the warm-up, really interests me. So why don't we start right there? And again, welcome, Jean. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's my honor. Thanks for asking me, and it's a delight to reconnect with you, Andrew.
Same here, same here. So what do you mean by warm-up?
So often in the world of therapy, and I think in the world of recovery in general, people think that they have to jump straight into action in their journey. And a lot of times they don't honor the warm-up that they have inside of themselves, right? So you and I, are being both clinicians, we're very familiar with the concept of the stages of change model, which is a model change that was created by three wonderful therapists, Norcross, Prochaska, and DiClemente, about what the change process looks like. And the first stage is actually pre-contemplation, where I don't think I have a problem, I'm fine. And then slowly people move to that ambivalent stage of contemplation. Oh, maybe there is something going on here. And then eventually they move to preparation, where they think, okay, if I'm going to change my life, then I have to think about what's that going to look like. So for example, if somebody is getting into recovery for sex addiction, they have to think about, oh, if I'm at an event and I might potentially get triggered, how do I take care of myself? So they think about that before they actually step into the visible action. But so often all of that work prior to the visible action is actually what we in psychodrama would call warm-up. Because the way I like to think about it, that there is no such thing as resistance. We say that in psychodrama all the time. There's no such thing as resistance. There's inadequate warm-up. Just because I'm not ready to move into the next stage of change doesn't mean that I'm not still interested in changing. It just means that my system is not ready to do that yet. And I know you're a somatic experiencing practitioner as well as I am. One of the things that I think gets people in trouble is they move too fast a lot of the time. Yeah. And they're not ready for that next stage of change. And so honoring that warm-up is so important. And like you, I'm a group worker primarily. And in a group, we have to pay attention as clinicians, we have to pay attention to the different levels of warm-up. Or in a family system, you and I, again, both have done a lot of work in the addiction field and recovery field. When I've worked with families, 4 or 5 or 6 or however many members of a family come in to do work with me, and 1 or 2 of them is all gung-ho, let's do this, let's get this done. And then there's other people who have a slower warm up and pace, who they need time to kind of catch up and feel safe enough to get ready to actually move towards change. And so it's important to honor everybody's in that process. So that's what I mean by warm up.
Sure. I mean, not only do I love that so much, but it just sounds super respectful and also makes room for the pacing, right?
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and Jacob Moreno, who created Psychodrama,
Hmm.
described warm up as the readiness to move into action. So I have to feel ready. If I do it too quickly, right? You and I, again, both SE practitioners, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the work of Res Momenicum, who wrote a number of books, but his first one, called My Grandmother's Hands,
Hmm.
he had a definition of trauma in that book that I use all the time. He said
Mm.
that trauma is anything that's too much, too fast, too soon.
Mm.
And I think of that in terms of the injury that happened, but I also think of it in terms of the repair, that if we go too quickly, we're going to tend to slide back, sometimes more further back than where we were because the fear gets so big. It's, oh no,
Hmm.
I'm not,
Hmm.
I'm not ready yet. Okay, well,
Hmm.
and when I started in social work school, one of the first things they taught me, start where the client is.
Exactly.
Not where I want them to be, where
Right.
they are.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Beautiful. I also want to just say that there's something about the very fundamental idea that trauma and addictions are almost always inseparable. That
agreed.
and that for our listeners' sake, I think you're starting to talk about both, but I want to really just highlight that that's what we see most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time.
Yes, and I think people often have this perception of what trauma means and what it looks
True.
like and what the experience is.
Right.
You and I have both been around long enough to remember the whole concept of big T trauma and little T trauma. Big T
Hmm.
traumas being things like the Northridge earthquake out here in California, a car accident, something like that. And the little
Hmm.
T traumas being more of those developmental harms, being called stupid, being not good enough, etc. Uh,
Hmm.
and I really tend to shy away from classifying how big it is, how little it is. The bottom
Right.
line is, again, too much, too fast, too soon.
Hmm.
And I bless the brilliance of people like myself and all those other recovering alcoholics, addicts, whomever out there in the
Hmm.
world, who found a way to cope with the
Hmm.
overwhelm to their
Right.
system. That was certainly my story when I turned to alcohol, is I needed a way to settle my nervous system, to calm my system down.
That's
And
right.
that was what I found
Right.
relatively early on. And when I discovered it, I thought, oh, now I know how to do this. The problem
Right.
is I didn't have a repertoire of other ways that I could do it.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't judge addiction.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for it because it saved my life, and I'm sure a lot of
Yeah.
listeners would feel the same. It works until it doesn't.
Exactly. It was an attempt to feel better.
Exactly.
It
And
just
so
was a
whether that
misfired.
was,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No, no,
you.
no. I was just going to say, but it was a misfired attempt because
It's a
it worked
misfired
until it
attempt.
exactly.
Yeah. I
Yes.
mean, I've worked with a number of people over the years who found food early on. They found masturbation early on. They found uh, dissociation. They found television. A lot of people I've worked with, they just completely disappeared into books from the time they were a very little kid. And all of them are just brilliant coping mechanisms that
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
discover. I really think it's genius.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk more specifically about psychodrama, since you are, in my opinion, one of the top psychodramatists in this part of the world, actually.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
It's true. And there tend to be a lot of misconceptions out there about it. So can you give us a simple definition of what psychodrama really is?
Sure. So, psychodrama is an action based method. So, rather than using talk therapy, we get up and move into action. And it is a way to explore the way I like to think about it. It's a way to explore what's going on in our hearts and our heads and putting it into concrete form. So, for example, if I have a negative voice in my head that tells me I'm not good enough, I could, in the context of a psychodrama, choose somebody to play the role of that voice and encounter that voice that lives inside of me in a way that I can ideally renegotiate the relationship between myself and that voice, or
Right.
maybe better understand the origins of that voice.
Sure.
Or one of the things I love to do with people is to find a new job description for that voice, or to change the job description. So that voice has been
Mm.
critical. Can we turn it somehow from judgment to appropriate discernment, for
Mhm.
example?
Mhm.
And so it is typically, psychodrama is typically done in a group setting, but it's certainly applicable for individuals, couples, families. I've done it in organizations. I've done it on a community level. But the biggest piece of it is we honor and follow the story of the person whose piece we are exploring. I don't lead. I do. I don't lead in the way that I don't have an agenda. I don't push them. I don't have an end point in mind that is my agenda. Together, we create what we call a contract, where we come up with a goal for what this piece of work is going to look like. And then my job is to actually follow you, not lead you. And so some of the misconceptions are sometimes people who are using what they're calling psychodrama are not actually doing psychodrama. They are jumping into action without a warm up, because we have to do warm up to help the group get connected and feel safe with one another,
Mm.
reveal whatever themes are in the room. Typical for anybody who's a group worker, they know those are some of the typical things we need to do. We have to constantly be
Right.
rebuilding safety, connection, etc. And
Mhm.
then when we do actually step into the piece, any roles that show up, think about doing a movie, right? If you were going to cast a movie of your own life, so say you're doing a psychodrama with your relationship with a sibling. I, as the director, and we use drama language, I, as the director, am not going to decide who's going to play that role. You are. And
Right.
then the person you choose, they don't know how to play your sibling. So I
Right.
do what's called role reversal, where I would have you, so say you were my protagonist, Andrew, I would have you
Mhm.
reverse into the role of your sibling, and
Mm.
I would interview you in that role. So,
Mhm.
Andrew's brother, tell me 3 things about your relationship with your brother you love, or
Mhm.
tell me about a couple of sticking points the two of you have, that kind of thing,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
the person playing your brother needs to know how to play that role.
Mhm.
So I'm not deciding what they say. I'm
Mhm.
not telling them what to say.
Mhm.
I'm not feeding lines to them to try to get somewhere in the piece. It's
Mhm.
not my piece, it's yours.
Right.
So, say, for example, the contract we made is that you want to better understand why you get so triggered around your brother. Well,
Mhm.
that will be
Mhm.
our goal. And
Yeah.
I'm going to help you. The Jacob Moreno's wife, Zerka, who was an extraordinary psychodramatist on her own,
Mhm.
used this term autonomous healing center. We all have this healing center inside of us.
Mhm.
So the way
Mhm.
I think about this work is that I'm a midwife helping you locate your healing center
Mhm.
and expand it so that you can live a healthier, happier life.
It's interesting, Gene, as you're talking, as a brain spotting therapist,
Yes.
we talk about being in the
The tail of the
tail of the
comet.
comet. You know
Exactly.
this.
I
It's
do know
just,
this.
it's the same idea. It's
Mhm.
beautiful. And I
Yeah,
love
I'm
that.
not the comet. You are.
That's right, exactly. So
Yes.
again, it's so respectful and it's so much about really our social work roots, right? Starting
Yes.
where the client is at.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
great.
And honoring where they want to get to. Again, not
Exactly.
where I want them to get to,
That's
but
right.
where they want to get to. Yeah.
Exactly. So talk to me about the importance of resourcing. I don't think our listeners have heard a whole lot about resourcing, maybe a little
Yes.
bit here and there. And how do you use that as part of sociometry and psychodrama?
Let's talk about resourcing first. One of my teachers years ago always used to say skills before affect. And what he meant by that is before we dive into the big emotion, we have to have interpersonal connections with people who
Mhm,
can
mhm,
support us. We have to have so-called intrapsychic resources, my honesty, my perseverance, my determination, right? And we
mhm,
also have the opportunity to have what are called transpersonal resources, my connection to the divine. Now, again, for anybody who's agnostic or an atheist, that divinity may manifest as sequoias or the ocean or anything, anyone that is going to provide them a sense of comfort and connection. One of the things I learned, I took Latin in high school because I grew up in a good Irish Catholic family, and that's what you do.
Right.
But I remember thinking when I heard the word spirituality talked about in recovery, that at its root, that word means to breathe.
Huh.
So when I think about spirituality and whatever that means for anyone, to me, that means what helps me breathe. Sometimes it's a connection with a good friend. Sometimes it's having my feet in the sand at the beach. Sometimes it's a prayer. Sometimes it's tapping into my own strength of some kind. And so when we think about resourcing, I want to help people establish those before we dive into the work. Because if you're in early recovery, and let's face it, in early recovery, your recovery is shaky. It's new. And so some of the resources might be your therapist, your sponsor, your best friend, your going to the gym and exercising. That might be a resource. Your dog, your cat. Doesn't matter who or what it is.
Right.
Well, that's not true. Sometimes the resources are unhealthy ones, and that's how we got in quote unquote trouble in the first place. But
Exactly.
resourcing is a really key point or key part of any healing process.
Yeah.
And whether that's using EMDR or brain spotting or psychodrama or somatic experiencing, we need those in place, because as we dip into the work, and I know you're familiar with this term, we need to pendulate so that if I go into the pain of my trauma or the discomfort of my recovery, I need, if you think of a pendulum, I need to have somewhere I can come out to where my body can go and relax and not be in that anxious or constricted place. And that could be a friend, again, it could be going out for a walk, it could be going to your church or your temple or whatever it is for you that is going to help you have that deep exhale and have your body settle so that you have time to integrate that work that you've just done. And so sociometry, which we haven't really talked about yet, it's really our warm-up phase in psychodrama, but sociometry is a way that it's actually a science and an art and an exercise, but it's a way that we measure the connections that we have with the people in our lives. One of my teachers used to say, we're measuring the soch, right? So the social connection that we have. So when we think about that in a group setting or in a family setting, or even with a couple, there are exercises that we use to help, again, build that safety and connection. And sometimes it's as simple as standing on a line with a polar opposite. So I used to, when I worked in an intensive outpatient program for substance use disorder, often on Mondays, when everybody had just come back from their weekend, I would do this continuum where one end represented, I had a really great weekend in terms of my recovery. And all the way at the other end was I had a really terrible weekend in terms of my recovery. And I would have people stand on the line and then share, maybe in a small group first and then out loud, so that people could tell the truth about how they were doing. The way that we resource with that is often we'll do small group sharing where people can share more intimately, or one of my favorite exercises we do in sociometry and psychodrama, which is never the first thing that we do because it's more intimate. We build up to it. But I'll give you an example from a training group I ran last weekend. One of the questions that I did in the closing on the last day, it was a multi-day training group, is I said, go put your hand on the shoulder of someone who helped you take a risk this weekend. So it's not only acknowledging my growth that I took the risk, but it's also acknowledging the connection that I have and what we would call co-regulation, right? That sense of I'm not alone in this, but acknowledging that co-regulation and expressing gratitude to somebody else in the group. Thank you. You took your risk. And so I got to take mine.
Mm.
And then when we do that in psychodrama, we actually, with permission, because people have physical and sexual trauma and they can't be touched, and I
Right.
honor that.
Right.
But we actually go place our hand on someone's shoulder and look them right in the eye and say, I chose you because I
Hmm.
watched you do this, and that inspired me to take that risk. And that's a way of resourcing through sociometry as well. Or sometimes, I remember many years ago, I had a guy in one of my groups. It was such an interesting group because when I worked in New York City in an IOP, we had a contract with the New York City Police Department. And so typically the people who ended up coming to treatment had had a DUI. So they were already mortified that they'd broken the law and they're an officer, right? And then when they got there, they had to check their revolver at the door. They didn't like that part either because it felt unsafe.
Right.
This guy didn't want to admit he had a problem, didn't want to be there, didn't want to participate. And I did a whole series of exercises, and I finally got to a question that was actually inspired for me by a dear colleague of mine. But I asked a question: if you were trapped behind enemy lines, put your hand on the shoulder of the person you would want to help you get out.
Wow.
Everybody in the group went and put their hand on his shoulder, and I watched him melt in front of my eyes
Mm.
because he felt so acknowledged and so seen. And for the first time in probably, I think he'd been there 2 weeks,
Hmm.
felt part of.
Sure.
So being able to use exercises like that, where we can actually see each other and acknowledge each other and appreciate each other, it's so powerful because so often, and you know this from your own work, so often when people come into recovery, the only way that anybody is seeing them in the world is as this active addict or
Hmm.
this mentally ill person or this quote unquote sick person. Have them be acknowledged for being something or someone else than that. It just opens up their world. Oh, you don't see me as this horrible sex addict. You see me as this loving friend or parent or partner. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Because their view has gotten so narrow when the addiction takes over. And it's like with a camera, we're expanding the aperture so that they can start to be seen as more than that and see themselves more than that.
Yeah. As you said that, Gene, I was thinking it opens up their world, but
Exactly.
it opens up their heart.
It opens up their heart.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
And
just
their
a
body. I mean, as a
exactly.
brain spotting and an SE practitioner, you know, it's more than the heart, but it's, you know,
Yeah.
so often in SD we talk about when we do find a sort of a positive place inside that we've pendulated to,
Uh-huh.
so often we look at the edges of that. We invite the client, just notice the edges of that and just notice if they can expand just a 0.5%. And if they can't, that's okay. Or maybe it's pulsating, right? Constricting and then opening and constricting and opening, but we're inviting that movement. And it really does. It helps people open their heart, which in turn helps them open up their whole nervous system.
Exactly. Yeah. So why don't we pivot to compulsive sexual behavior for a
Sure.
moment? And I'm wondering if you can give us an example of how you have used psychodrama to work with people who have problematic sexual behaviors.
The one client that I think of so much in terms of this, and I'm obviously going to speak in very broad terms because I want to protect anonymity. In some models of recovery, and I'm certainly open to hearing your perspective on this, but some models of recovery from compulsive sexual behavior, I think it was Patrick Carnes who created that model where there's, and forgive me, I don't know the language as well as I used to, but sort of a red light, a yellow light, and a green light in terms of behavior. And so I remember working with this one gentleman years ago who had certain green light behaviors. And then there was one behavior that was very red light. And he knew that he was deep into his addiction and had lost his connection to himself when that happened. And he was a heterosexual man, and we were working through this trigger around women that he had that might often lead him to this disconnected place from self and engaging in behavior that was not healthy for him.
Hmm.
And I happened to have, this is why I love metaphor and I love visual, and psychodrama is so visual. I happened to have this metal statue in my office. It was maybe 12 or 15 inches high. And I think I bought it at IKEA or something. And it was this pose of it was a stick figure, but it was a pose of a woman dancing. And so I had it in my office. And one day we were stepping into a piece of work around this red light behavior of his. No connection to a red light district, obviously, although it's interesting. That's where that came. I'm curious about that etymology now. But he happened to catch a glimpse of the statue, and it had been there for months and months that I'd been working. He'd never really noticed it before.
Yeah.
And that became this symbol for him of being deep into the throes of his active addiction.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And so we ended up doing psychodrama work around that, where we had to explore his distance from it, or his closeness, and what were the triggers that moved him closer, moved him farther away. What could he put between it and himself so that he wasn't engaging in this red light behavior? But the thing that really stuck out for me is when he was really close to relapsing into that behavior many times, when we would do work around this, what he needed to do at the end of the session, because I'm a big fan of doing containment through action, meaning, can you leave something here this week? Can you let go of something and leave it here in my office so that you don't have to take it with you? He took the statue and he locked it in my file cabinet. And I watched his whole body. Again, it was that, as it was locked away for the week. And week after week, I always had to remember to put it back in the file cabinet before he came in for his next session, because I didn't, right? Because for other people, that statue meant something completely different. But week after week, it became a metaphor and a way to work with that particular trigger, where it would be locked in the cabinet, and I would check in with him. Do we want to work around it this week, or do we need to leave it there? And so I love using objects like that and concretizing things like that, because it becomes so visceral and so clear what the triggers are, the things I can do to keep a distance between myself and that behavior, for example. So that's just one example that I think of in terms of working with compulsive sexual issues.
So interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing is the empowerment or the agency to regulate the emotional distance or the actual physical distance.
Or the concrete distance, yeah.
Exactly. It was so powerful and empowering to give him that choice each and every time, because he knew it was there.
He knew it was there. It wasn't going anywhere. I mean, I'm sure you've done podcasts on this before, but I think particularly for issues around sex, food, money, you can't not engage in those. It's not like alcohol or drugs where you can, or even shopping. That's another one for people where there can be compulsive behavior.
Yeah.
But you got to engage with those things. It's not like you can just put them on the shelf like you can with alcohol.
Exactly. You, as a somatic experiencing practitioner, I'm curious if you could give maybe one example of how SE, as we call it, and psychodrama can be blended. How does that work?
Yes. I can give you actually an example from my own personal work.
Wonderful.
I have a wonderful SE practitioner that I was working with for quite some time, and I have a history of a number of surgeries over the years. I had a really bad fall at one point and had back surgery, but even as a child, and this might be interesting for some of your listeners, I wonder if people identify with this. I wet my bed till I was 9 years old, and I studied a modality called psychodramatic body work, which really looks at where anger, fear, and sadness are stored in the body. And I remember what a revelation it was for me that fear lives in the bladder and the kidneys. And I thought, no wonder I wet my bed till I was 9. There was all this fear happening in my house, and I had nowhere to go with it.
Right.
And then actually one of the things I would do is when I would wet my bed, I would go crawl into my sister's bed. And she was she still is a safe person for me, and I would get comfort. I was such a smart little kid.
Resourceful, yeah.
Very resourceful. There was one experience I had as a kid where I had a procedure done in a doctor's office that was incredibly scary and painful. And so I was sometimes, as you know, in SE, we are actually on a massage table and we're doing hands-on work. That's not true for all SE practitioners. If you go to do SE work, it doesn't mean you ever have to be touched, just for your listeners so they know that.
Sure.
But my SE practitioner knows I'm a psychodramatist. She knows that I tend to bring different roles and people into my work.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, again, from SE work, I was lying on the table and she had her hands on my kidneys, which is very typical work in SE if you're doing touch work.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to warm up to this memory of being on the doctor's table and having this very painful and very scary test done.
Right, right.
And sometimes this happens, very often it happens so unconsciously, my right leg just started lifting up off the table, and we do everything very slowly in SE because the body needs time to catch up to the memory. And so my leg just started moving up, and then I was pulling it in to bend it towards my body. And we were both just noticing this. I was still very present. She was tracking it, I was tracking it, and I started to, at one point, it came all the way up. And so if you can imagine this, I'm lying on the table and my right leg bent all the way up. And then I flexed my foot and I started moving my leg out. And I realized in that moment, it was that unexpressed ability to follow through on what I wanted to do when that procedure happened. I wanted to kick the doctor and get him away from me. And so my body was doing that piece and I was just following it. But what I did is I added in the psychodrama piece because in my mind's eye, I was imagining him in the room and I used my voice and I used my words with quite a few expletives, thank you very much. Basically, between the words and my sense of agency and my leg, I got to replay that scene, which we do in psychodrama all the time. And my body got to experience kicking him away. And in my mind's eye, watching him go flying across the room and screaming at him to get his hands off of me. And so it was such a satisfying experience because that had been sitting in my body, no lie, that had been sitting in my body for probably close to 50 years. So that's an example of psychodrama coming together with SE, and it happens a lot.
I'm so glad that you shared all that, and I hope our listeners understand the exquisite nature of what you're describing, because that unfinished body memory
Yes.
Was needing to come out. And if it
Yes,
doesn't come out, it causes all kinds of vulnerabilities.
that's right.
And so what a amazing story. I'm glad you shared that, and thank you for sharing something,
Well, in
you know.
psychodrama, we would refer to that energy as an act hunger. It's a desire to complete an action that never got to happen. So much of the work we do in psychodrama is about raising our spontaneity.
Uh-huh.
Spontaneity in psychodrama is defined as the ability to come up with a new response to an old situation, to do it
Right.
differently than I might have done
Right.
it in the past, or an adequate response to a new situation. Notice it's not a perfect response, it's an adequate response to a new situation. Basically, what has happened is our spontaneity has been blocked.
Right.
And through psychodrama, we unblock it.
Right. Yeah.
It's allowed to finally complete that threat response cycle. Because as you said, if I don't get to complete that, it gets stuck in the body in dis-ease of some kind.
Exactly. Yeah. We're almost out of time today, and what I want to ask you is if there were a few takeaways that you would really want our listeners to hear at this point, what might they be?
The first thing that comes to mind, since most people, I think, in your audience are dealing with sexual recovery, It's something that I tell myself, again, I know I've said this earlier, but I want to repeat it. I tell myself this a lot as a recovering person myself, that I did the best that I knew how at the time that things were happening, and it worked until it didn't. And now I need to find new ways of coping and new solutions and new possibilities. It was really important for me to keep repeating that to myself, especially in early recovery, because the potential for shame is so high. And it's a normal, natural thing that I'm going to take two steps forward, and then a step back. It just is. So I really appreciate having some grace and compassion for myself. The other thing is, if they are interested in psychodrama work, I think it's really important, if they're looking for someone out in the community, there's a couple of different resources I want to mention that people can look for. One is a website for the American Board of Examiners. We have a body that basically administers the tests, upholds the ethics, the standards, etc. The website for that is psychodramacertification.org, and they can find a psychodramatist there. But I think it's really important, if they don't have a psychodramatist in their area, and that's true in many parts of the United States and certainly around the world, that they ask really good questions of the person who they're going to work with. The same way that they interview a therapist to find out how they work. I want to know, how much training have you had in this? And are you being supervised by somebody? And the only other thing I would say as a woman in long-term recovery is, there's going to be peaks and valleys all along the way. And I never have to do anything alone ever again. There is help out there. And I will also say, and this is hard for some people to hear, but I wish somebody had told me this when I first got into recovery. Not everybody's going to be happy that I'm changing and getting better.
Right.
Especially if they have been part of me staying, quote unquote, sick. And the other reality is, there's some people I'm going to outgrow. And I have over the years, because I'm continuing to heal and they're not willing to.
Right.
And I bless them, and I doesn't mean I have to hate them or be mad. I love them, and I need to move on.
Those sentiments are so powerful and so concise. I don't know if anyone on any of our episodes has actually ended with such an inspirational and well-rounded message. So I really, really appreciate that, and appreciate you being so transparent about your own recovery, and just doing the work that you do, Jean. I just admire you so much. So I can't thank you enough. I really, really appreciate you being here, and I'm sure our paths will continue to cross one way or the other.
I hope so. And the admiration goes both ways, my friend. I've been amazed at what you have done and how you have continued to carry the message of recovery and healing out into the world. You're quite a gift to the people who work with you. And people who don't, who read your book and the workbook. And yeah, I'm incredibly impressed.
Well, please take good care, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Thanks again for asking me to be here. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening today. It was so great sharing the time with my colleague and friend, Jean Campbell, and discussing this really vital topic. She can be reached through her website at theactioninstitute.com. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.